Be seated. I have to confess something. I come to you this morning very, very tired. And I doubt that I'm alone in being tired this morning. I am tired of checking the news and seeing reports of acts of violence yet again. Tired of injustice and of persecution of people of color being the status quo. Tired of wondering when the next in an all too long list of events that bring to the fore of our minds the reality of race in America will occur. When the next Charleston will occur. When the next Ferguson will occur. And now today we can ask, when will the next Charlottesville occur? I'm tired most of all of people who want to use the wonderful diversity of culture, language, and skin color that we have been given by God as a wedge to divide people who are equally beloved in the eyes of God, who ignore the reality that each and every person on this earth is marvelous and worthy of love in the eyes of God. Brothers and sisters, I am tired of living in the storm that the sins of racism and white supremacy have brought about. The news of the last 24 hours is the sort of news that paralyzes. The enormity of the division, of the hatred, the violence, the enormity of the sin is enough to make us numb and afraid. It sometimes feels to me like events like these are scheduled on some sort of cosmic calendar to remind us of what reality can be like. Now, the notion of some sort of cosmic reminder system is ridiculous, of course. But all the same, we're reminded of this reality again and again and again. We were reminded of a reality that many of us are lucky to forget, or at least to tuck away in the backs of our minds in between these major reminding events. We are reminded that many of our sisters and brothers of color live each day in fear of violence, live each day in the presence of markers and memorials commemorating those who would have kept them in chains. By the way, one of those markers that marks the site of Nathan Bedford Forrest's slave market sits right here on our own block. We are reminded that for many, the events of Charlottesville are not so much surprising as they are an amplified version of the status quo. And into this fear and numbness that accompany news of the sort we've been receiving from Virginia comes a flood of questions. What are we to do now? How do we respond? What's next? Are we really as powerless to act as we feel? And the deluge of questions continues. The water around us begins to rise, and soon we find ourselves knee-deep in water without a bailer in sight, feeling overwhelmed, feeling tired. Our gospel reading for this morning doesn't say anything about how the disciples were feeling out there on their small boat in the middle of a storm. But I'd hazard to guess that they weren't feeling particularly good about their situation. Many of them had been fishermen before they answered Jesus' call, and so they would have known what to do in a situation like that. I imagine them pulling down their sails and putting down their heads and doing what they needed to do in order to stay upright and to stay afloat until the wind had passed. Given their situation, it's easy to assume that they would have been at least somewhat afraid, and they very well may have been. Even experienced sailors get nervous in treacherous seas. But according to the author of Matthew, The disciples' feelings of terror stem from witnessing Jesus walking out amongst the whitecaps in the pouring rain, rather than from the whitecaps and the state of the sea itself. They weren't afraid of the storm so much as they were afraid of Jesus, the Jesus who they followed, demonstrating this power and mastery over the powerful sea that they knew so well. And the reason they were afraid is that they knew that no one leaves an encounter with such power unchanged. Jacob left his encounter with God with a lifelong limp. Moses left the top of Mount Sinai transformed. Even closer to home for them, their first encounters with Jesus resulted in their leaving their homes, their families, and their jobs to follow him. It's not hard to imagine them wondering how much more this encounter would change them. Because, my friends, we don't get to encounter God without being transformed, without being called into becoming fuller versions of ourselves that are closer to who God created us to be than we were before we had an encounter. And so it is in this moment of terror on the sea that Peter does something totally shocking. Now, our expectation with Peter is that he's going to do something brash, so his getting out of the boat doesn't come as much of a surprise. This is, after all, the same Peter who, in the Gospel of John, jumps naked out of his fishing boat in order to run to see the risen Christ on the beach. But what is surprising is what he says right before he gets out of the boat. Peter calls out to Jesus and asks him to call him out of the boat. Peter knows that he wants to go. He wants to step out of the relative safety of the boat and walk with Jesus, but he just can't bring himself to do it. He's too afraid. Standing in the boat, torn between his desire to be with Jesus on the one hand and his desire to hide from the storm in the shelter of the boat on the other. But Jesus calls out to him. Jesus calls Peter to take the next step, to take that big step, and to leave the boat. And this is exactly what Peter does. He steps out of the boat and onto the water. Now, in the end, Peter needed Jesus' help to stay above water, just like all of us do. But he took that step. Jesus called, and he stepped out into the unknown, out into the terrifying sea with its buffeting waves and undulating surface. Peter stepped out of the boat and followed Jesus. Now, the thing about getting out of a boat in the middle of the sea, in the middle of a windstorm, is that you can't do it without getting wet. Walking on water or no walking on water, if you step out of a boat in the middle of a storm, you're going to get wet. And so if we're to follow Peter's example and take our own first steps onto the stormy sea, we need to be prepared to get slapped by cresting waves and covered in ocean spray. Any way you look at it, taking that first step and each step after it is a risk. We risk losing sight of the boat and the false security it gives us. We risk being overwhelmed by the strength and violence of the waves. We risk losing our footing. Most importantly, we risk losing sight of Jesus, our reason for being on the water in the first place. As we risk all of these things, Jesus is still there, walking alongside that water with us, calling us deeper into what we began when we stepped off that edge, deeper into relationship with him, and deeper into working for justice, deeper into the work of building up the kingdom of God, and reminding us that no matter how overwhelmed we are, no matter how tired we may get, no matter how often we may stumble, falter, or even sink, that he is there with us, with a steady hand for us to grab onto. Events like what happened in Charlottesville Friday night and Saturday have the capacity to simultaneously instill in us a desire to sit tight and weather the storm right where we are, and to stand up and step out into the unknown of the stormy sea. The way ahead is not always clear, and we may only be able to see a short distance ahead. But Jesus is calling us to step out into the waves and to follow him where he leads, calling us to follow him to a place where we can see that what the dreamers have dreamed has indeed come to fruition, to follow him to a place where the bitter fruits of white supremacy have been thrown away once and for all. But in order to do that, we first need to step off the edge of the boat. We need to step off the edge of the boat and into the fray, off the edge of the boat and into the storm. In the midst of the storms that we are trying to weather as a society, we have in our sight a Jesus who calls out to us and says, I know you're overwhelmed. I know you're tired. Come, step off the boat. The water will help you wake up, and I'll be walking right beside you.